Hey guys, welcome back to Listen Champ for a pretty special little video. I didn't think I would make this, but as I was finishing a custom cardboard model the other day, I thought I could show you how I make them, how I used to make them when I began, how I make them today, as well as little anecdotes on the vehicles themselves. I'll start with my oldest models, and obviously I don't have any pictures of their making. I started doing that when I was 12 or so, and now I'm 27, so that's... Anyways. At the time I was playing Blazing Angels on Wii, I don't know if you know it, but I really wanted to make models of my favorite planes. The first one I did was the Messerschmitt 110. The Me 110 was a twin-engine German fighter from early World War II. It was successful during the invasion of Poland and France, but it was completely outclassed when the Luftwaffe tried to bomb England. It still had good armament and range, and could fit a radar, so it was made a night fighter. Now to make the model, I found a 3-view plan on this French website. This website is a goldmine for plane plans. I'll put the link in the description. So what I always do, I print it and make the model at the printed size. For this one I made a pretty simple frame using my dependable glue gun, but then I didn't think I could do round shapes with cardboard, so I filled it with paper mache. You can see the result isn't smooth or equal, but that wasn't that bad for a first. For the wings, I wanted to make a real wing shape, but I wasn't too good and I just put a piece of cardboard that I cut according to the plan. Obviously it made the wing too square, not curved, and I didn't account for cardboard thickness, so it's way too thick. Soon after I did the Yakovlev 4, a pretty similar plane. Oh yeah, and one thing about me at the time, I was your kind of average young teenager, wannabe history nerd, wannabe communist, so of course I would just make Soviet and Nazi stuff, because the bad guys are always cooler. I even had the Soviet flag in my room, so that gives you an idea. The Yak 4 was a light bomber, and only 90 were built. Nothing special about it, I just made it because it was Soviet. I built this one the exact same way as the other, with paper mache for the body, and overall it's slightly better. For the next one I wanted a modern jet, so I made one of the best Soviet planes of the Cold War and still used today, the MiG-29. As usual for Soviet planes, the accent was on simplicity and maneuverability, and it had good speed. It was used in the Gulf War by the Iraqis, in Kosovo by the Serbs, by the Soviet government in the Civil War, and today by both sides in the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I use the same technique, a cardboard frame with paper mache, but you can see it's a little bit smoother. That's because some years later I decided to carve some of my models to remove the excess and make them smoother. For the reactors I just made cardboard tubes, pretty basic. For the next one I wanted an artillery or anti-tank gun, and of all the coolest, most badass guns in World War II, I chose the Pak-36. No, it wasn't a bad anti-tank gun at the beginning of the war. In fact, early variants of the Panzer III were equipped with this during the invasion of Poland and France, and during Barbarossa, but already in France against medium and heavy tanks, and in Russia against the T-34 and the KV-1, the Germans realized it was underpowered. For this one I had to find a plan on Google, because Richard Ferrier only has airplanes, but it wasn't too much of a problem. It's entirely made of cardboard, with bamboo sticks on the sides and for the axle. Right after that, another plane I loved in Blazing Angels, the FW-190. The Germans in World War II relied mainly on the Me 109 throughout the war, but they developed the FW-190 in parallel. It began service in late 1941 and proved superior to the Me 109 at low altitude, but it wasn't that good to intercept high altitude Allied bombers. It was also the first true fighter bomber of the Luftwaffe. This one you can see that I carved the paper mache with a blade again, and the wings are still too angular. When I saw the movie Saving Private Ryan for the first time I was about 13-14, and I really wanted to make the Tiger tank. The Tiger was Germany's main heavy tank in the war and was introduced in Africa and the USSR in 1942. Its armament was great, its armor was really thick, and quickly gained a reputation of invincibility. Still, it was very unreliable, hard to manufacture, and the armor was penetrable by guns like the 17-pounder on the Sherman Firefly. This was a departure from planes for me, but overall it gives a nice result. Two things about the turret. The gun is not the original one. This is the original, so you understand why I wanted to remake it. For the turret, I really wanted it to spin. Back when I was about 10 or 11, I was a big Ben 10 fan and I made a replica of his watch with cardboard. I wanted it to spin, so I thought of this very basic system which I still use for my tanks. You have the non-moving basis, then you have the basis of the turret with a hole in the right spot. I make a little budge with hot glue, exactly the right size, then I put a cap on it so it won't move upwards. I build the rest of the upper part separately and glue it to the basis. Otherwise the tracks are just stripes of cardboard with glue strips, and the wheels are attached to the tank by bits of bamboo sticks. If I made the German tank, I had to make a Soviet one. Obviously I wanted to make the T-34, but the turret had rounded edges, so I settled on the KV-1. The KV-1 was the Soviets' main heavy tank at the beginning of the German invasion, and was actually better than the T-34. Sorry T-34 fans, I refer you to Laserpig's video. It was however harder and more expensive to produce, and those were the two things the Soviets hated the most. I followed the exact same technique for this tank. Notice how back then I left glue excess and patent on it, which didn't give the best result visually. The wheels are simply two round pieces with a cardboard rectangle in between. It's not too pretty, but it would take me forever to do a round piece for each. While I was at it, I made another Soviet tank, the PD-76. This one was because I wanted to do something used by the North Vietnamese during the Vietnam War, obviously because the communists were the good guys for me, and the T-54 was way too round. The PT-76 was a light amphibious tank made for reconnaissance, was fielded by a lot of countries, and saw combat in lots of conflicts. For mine, notice two things. The hull kind of bends. At the time I wasn't building a frame inside to make sure it was straight. Also for the turret. It's kinda like a sawed-off cone, so all I had to do was use the plan, measure the circumference and angle, do some math, and then be able to draw the perfect piece. While I was in the Vietnam War thematic, I did the MiG-21. The MiG-21 is still used today and was originally developed in the 1950s. More than 11,000 were made and served in a crap load of countries. It was fast and agile, but the engine was unreliable and it was pretty bad at low altitudes. The main factor again was that it was easy to use and didn't need much maintenance, so ideal for exporting to poor countries. For this one I made a cardboard cylinder, and the nose and the upper part were again paper mache which I carved. Notice how the wings are not angular anymore, they're not perfect but have a better curve. Paper mache wasn't ideal for making planes, so I decided to make this one with only cardboard, the MiG-31. The MiG-31 was a Soviet interceptor, basically the successor of the well-known and crappy MiG-25, but with better electronics, a stronger frame, and better handling at low altitudes. It's used today in Ukraine by the Russians. My model is kind of a simplified version. I wasn't too sure how to make it properly, but it's still decent. That's also when I began using my glue gun to melt excess glue and make surfaces smoother. After that I went back to German tanks with the Panzers 3 and 4. I began playing Forgotten Hope 2, which I still find to be one of the best World War II FPS games of all time, even though the graphics are old.
So, you think you can handle this? I think not.
I loved especially the desert maps, and the Panzer 3J and the Panzer 4F were my favorite tanks. The Panzer III was Germany's main medium tank at the beginning of the war. It was used on all fronts and became the basis for assault guns and tank destroyers. The Panzer IV meanwhile was initially meant to be an infantry support tank with a short barrel 75mm gun, but it was upgraded with a long barrel version when it became clear its main role would be tank warfare. We could argue it was Germany's best tank, in the sense that it was easy to modify and upgrade, easy to make, and it had an all-round good performance. Funny detail, it was used during the Six-Day War in 1967 by the Syrian army, while the Israelis had some upgraded Shermans. Both sides of course had more modern tanks like the T-55 and the Centurions, but still. My Panzer III wasn't bad, but see how the Panzer IV is better. It's smoother, the barrel is very nicely done, the tracks too, and even the exhaust behind. Overall it's still one of my favorite. What I did beginning with them was, instead of cutting separate piece for every feature, I would cut a larger piece and fold it to get a smoother finish. I also made an M1 Abrams tank, which was blasphemy for me because I was anti-American, and a Messerschmitt 109 for my cousin, but I don't have any pictures of them. For the Messerschmitt, I developed a technique which I would use for all my planes afterwards, the first of which was the Mitsubishi A6M Zero. The Zero is one of the most well-known planes of all time. At the beginning of the war with the Japanese, the Americans were shocked by how good the plane was and how well trained the pilots were. It was probably the best plane in the Pacific at the time. It was fast, agile, well armed, had a great climbing ability, and could be launched from carriers. It wasn't robust though. A few hits could set it on fire or kill the pilot. Eventually the Americans developed planes that were superior in every aspect, while the Japanese struggled to develop new planes in numbers. For this one, what I did, I'll show you with a more recent plane. So basically I cut a piece from a side view, I glue a bamboo stick to make sure it doesn't bend, then I put pieces like this to make a proper frame, almost like the real planes. Then you have the annoying part. I need to cut pieces which will exactly fit to cover the frame pieces, and it can take from 10 to 30 minutes for one piece, depending on the shape. For the Zero, it was easy, being pretty round. If there were gaps or imperfections, I would just add hot glue, then sand or carve it until I had a nice smooth surface. For the wings, I also started doing a proper wing shape with a proper frame inside, which accounted for the cardboard thickness. Next, another MiG. The MiG-17 was subsonic, very agile, and well armed with 23 and 37mm guns. It was used in many countries, but mostly by Arab countries against Israel and by the North Vietnamese against the Americans. The Americans were really surprised that the plane was 1. Any good, 2. That it was well piloted, and 3. That they were forced in dogfights against it. Prior to the Vietnam War, the US air doctrine was all about strategic bombing, so dogfighting, or hassling as it was called, was deemed to be a thing of the past. It all went up in smoke when the MiG-17 destroyed Thunder Chiefs and Phantoms, which weren't equipped or trained for that at all at the beginning. I did the plane with the same technique I told you before, and you can see a little bit the lines of separation between cardboard panels. For the painting, I did an Egyptian Air Force paint scheme. Also note the wings on my planes were getting better and better. Sometime later, it was maybe in 2014-2015, I did my last model for a while. It was also the time when I changed my political opinions and I went from an anti-American, pro-Soviet, pro-Russia, Iran, China, Venezuela, you name it, to understanding the US, learning to respect it, getting interested, reading about it, and eventually collecting books on US politics. I have quite a few presidents here. It would have been blasphemy a couple years before, but I did the M2 howitzer. The M2 was a great howitzer which was used in World War II, Korea, Vietnam, and is still used by the Korean military today. It's like the M2 Browning, just a great piece of equipment. Here, if you compare it to my previous gun, you can see the change in the detail and the care I took to hide glue marks. The barrel, the axle, and the legs were reinforced by bamboo sticks. This was my last model for a while. I just lost interest honestly, but in 2017 I decided to make a new one. I was in the midst of reading Marshall Carver's books on the North African campaign in World War II. That was another tank I liked from Forgotten Hope 2, the Matilda. It was a heavy infantry support tank, so well protected but slow, with a cast turret and hull which could withstand 88mm rounds, which was good, and was one of the main British tanks in the desert before the Churchill replaced it. I won't lie, it was a pretty tough one to make. And in fact, at some point I just lost interest again and left the turret and the unfinished hull on my desk for 4 years. In 2021, I decided to end it once and for all. The turret was the hardest part. It was again like a sawed-off cone, but with a vertical cylinder piece, with a flat front plane, and a weird turret mantle, so altogether hard. The front of the hull was round, so I had to build a frame inside to make it perfect. The side skirts were a challenge, but I just built a frame behind them and glued them on it. The exhaust pipe was really hard to do, with bamboo sticks that I had to join with glue and cardboard I would carve. There are supposed to be 2 of them, but there was only 1 on my plan, so I said, David, good enough. The paint job took me several hours, and remains the hardest paint job I had to do. It's a peculiar camouflage pattern, beige with light blue and dark blue. It's meant to break the silhouette of the tank against the desert horizon. After doing the colors, I took some dried beige and rubbed it on the paint to give a dusty look. Then same thing, it was 2 more years before I decided to make more. Last year during the holidays, I had a sudden streak of nostalgia and I wanted to make models again, but I didn't know which one. I asked some friends if they wanted me to do one, and a friend asked for a Leopard 2A4, the same used in the Canadian military. The Leopard 2 is a German tank and is one of the best main battle tanks today. It's well armored, well armed, with good electronics, engine, and altogether a very good tank. It's notably used by the Ukrainians today against the Russians, but since the Russians built strong fortifications with extensive minefields and the Ukrainians don't have air superiority, there wasn't a great tank offensive yet, mainly skirmishes. I have to say it was complicated to make. When doing a plane, it's hard, it's repetitive, but it's simple to do. While a tank, it's easier but more complicated to do. You're following? There are so many different angles on the turret, and especially underneath, so I had to determine how to make it with the frame inside and all. You see here all the different pieces. I have to say I'm very happy how it turned out. My accuracy when making this now is 0.5 millimeter. The gun was a moderate challenge too, but nothing I couldn't handle, while the hull was easy. All the little details took time, but I'm very happy about the paint job. I always use acrylic and I wanted to give it a muddy look, so I used 3 shades of brown and I think the result is fine. My friend was really happy and that's all that counts. Next, I figured what I wanted to do for myself. I'm in the midst of doing a huge 3-part video on the Vietnam War and I read thousands of pages of books, including on the Air War. I wanted to make a lesser known plane and I settled for the F100. The F100 Super Sabre, nicknamed the Hun, was designed when the US government was really pouring in money in the 1950s to make the best planes around against the Soviet threat. It was one of the first supersonic jets. It was used in Vietnam, first in North Vietnam during the Rolling Thunder bombings as an escort and missile site suppression, but then was relegated as the main Air Force air support jet for operations in South Vietnam. It was one of the hardest planes I ever made, probably the hardest. The reason is the shape. It's not a nice little round shape, nah. It's some kind of weird ass shape going from oval to a round triangle to a round at the end. Making proper frame pieces was a nightmare, and covering them was even worse. The result was a bit uneven, so what I did was using an electric orbital sander. I was afraid it would rip the plane apart, but nope. Even 80 grit was okay. I was really happy with the result. For the wings I made a frame again, with carved bamboo and tailor-made pieces of cardboard. The paint was pretty hard, it took me a while. I really wanted to replicate this camo pattern, so I had to get the colors right, do a nice smooth job, but the hardest part was the insignias. I wasn't sure I would be able to do it with the paint, but they did it up well. This is my last one, the F4F Wildcat. Again, I wanted to do a lesser known plane. It was a US naval fighter at the beginning of the Pacific War and fought against the Zeros, notably at Guadalcanal, Coral Sea, and Midway. It was outclassed by the Zeros in terms of speed, maneuverability, and range. The Wildcat meanwhile was better in dive and was armored, notably behind the pilot. American pilots learned to avoid dogfighting and did hit-and-run tactics by diving on the Zeros. It was later replaced by the much better F6 Hellcat and the F4U Corsair. It was easier to make than the F100. The shape went from round to slightly oval to round, so no big deal. I'm especially satisfied with the wings. As usual, I don't make the propellers because they would be too fragile. For the paint job, it's mostly good. I did the Guadalcanal paint job, so 2 shades of blue-gray, and the stars didn't have the red dots in them to avoid confusion with the Japanese insignia. The problem is, as the acrylic paint dries, it always becomes darker, so you need to correct this by making your color a bit lighter, but I overdid it and my color is a bit too light, but it's not so bad. Also, you can still see the separations a bit, but it's similar to the real thing in a way, so I don't make a fuss. Well, that was it. I hope you liked my collection because it was many years in the making. Although it's hard to do, it's always fun. One plane I love and want to make is the F-15 Eagle. But but the problem is it has way too many small round features and it's not really doable with cardboard. But anyways, I think I have enough models. As I said, I'm currently preparing a huge 3-part video on the Vietnam War, so like and subscribe, and I'll see you around.